Hmm. That's hi, dear Sangha. Welcome to the last episode of Sangha Storytime, where we'll hear the last chapter of A Taste of Earth by Thich Nhat Hanh. And the last chapter is called Blood Pearls. News that troops from the neighbouring kingdom of Troy had crossed the northern border of our lac plunged the people into panic. Princess Tan Chao was certain the news was false. Surely the invading troops were from the kingdom of Tan and not from Troy, the kingdom of her beloved husband. She remembered how 6 months earlier, shortly before her husband Trong Tai returned to visit his homeland, he told her how worried he was that Tan might invade our lac at any moment. He said, "In the event the Tan army invades, our two kingdoms must join forces to repel them. If the invasion takes place before my return, how will I know where to find you? In the confusion, you may be forced to flee the capital." Tan Chao thought for a moment and then said, "I understand that if Tan invades our two countries, it will be necessary for you to remain with your army to fight. When you return to our lac to find me, follow the path marked by goose feathers from my cloak. I will pluck several feathers from my feathered cloak and place them at every crossroad I pass to indicate which road I have taken." King Dong did not share his daughter's belief that the invaders were from Tan. He said, "Tan has not recovered from the last year. Their new dynasty is still too weak and disorganized to plan the invasion of another country. I never suspected your husband could be so treacherous. The reconciliation between our two countries after the last war, symbolized by your marriage, has turned out to be no more than part of a plot to ruin our kingdom. With all my heart, I regret that I ever allowed you to wed the Prince of Troy." With the entire country of our lac convinced that Troy was invading, the princess knew it was futile to try to convince her father otherwise. But she knew that her husband could never betray her. No one knew him better than she. She knew he considered our lac a second home. He had no reason to cause trouble between their two kingdoms. Furthermore, why would he destroy the rare and beautiful relationship he shared with her? In any case, Trong Tai was well aware that his father's kingdom was no match for our lac in war. His father, Tri Da, had already been defeated in his attempt to conquer our lac, thanks to the king Dong's magic bow that could disperse entire armies. It was because of the very bow that King Troy Da signed a treaty with King Dong, pledging peaceful relations. To show his sincerity, King Troy Da even suggested his son marry King Dong's daughter. Because King Dong desired stable and harmonious relationships between the two kingdoms, he agreed, but only on the condition that his son-in-law follow the old customs of our lac and live with his bride's family for 3 years. In the happy atmosphere of restored peace, the wedding lifted the people's hopes and spirits. In the capital and countryside, people hung lanterns and flower garlands to celebrate the union of their princess with the Prince of Troy. The festivities lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Although Princess Tan Chao was at first a little shy and nervous, she soon fell in love with a handsome young prince. He was an accomplished, cultured young man and expressed deep and tender love for the princess. They seemed a perfect match. People surrounded their carriage wherever they went and tossed flowers to the young couple. Sometimes the carriage could barely move forward, the crowds were so thick. The princess loved to travel throughout the kingdom, and so they took many excursions. Tan Chao noticed how her husband jotted down notes wherever they went. She did not ask him what he was writing. No doubt he was recording all their happy moments to share in precious memories in the future. A year passed. One day, King Troi Da sent letters to both King Andong and his son. He said he missed his son and wanted him to return home for a 6-month visit. Tan Chao could tell how torn her husband felt. He wanted to obey his father's wishes, but he was most reluctant to leave her behind. He suggested she join him. She would then have a chance to see his home. The princess was delighted with the idea, and so was most disappointed when her father refused. He gave the excuse that the period of 3 years had not yet passed, and so he could not allow Tan Chao to follow her husband. Tan Chao knew that her father's real reason was that he could not bear the thought of her being absent, even for a few months. The couple pleaded with him 3 times, but each time his answer was no. As the day for her husband's departure neared, Tan Chao grew ever more sad. Her tears fell like rain, and Trong Tai hesitated over whether or not he should go. But on the appointed day, he and his attendants mounted their steeds and began their journey home. He looked back and saw Tan Chao standing in the palace courtyard, looking as forlorn as a weeping willow. When, several months later, news of the invasion reached King Andong, he exclaimed, "Can it be King Trang Dai no longer fears my magic crossbow?" Confident he could not lose the war, King Andong laughed and sipped a glass of wine. News of fierce, bloody battles soon reached the capital. However, the invaders were advancing like a hurricane, leaving death and destruction in their wake. When a scout arrived with the news that the invaders were closing in on the capital, the king knew it was time to take out the magic bow and face the enemy. He dressed in full battle attire and mounted his steed. The invading troops poured into Phong Ki like waves of a stormy sea. They broke through our lax lines of defence as if they were no more than sticks of bamboo. The Troy troops carried thick straw shields that could not be pierced by the arrows of our lax soldiers. When our lax sent in ground troops, Troy countered by sending in their cavalry. The northern half of the capital quickly fell to the enemy. King Aldak galloped into the fray and prepared to raise his magic bow against the invaders, confident they would soon be dispersed by the bow's powerful magic. One aim of the bow and the soldiers would be scattered by thousands of arrows flying as quickly as lightning bolts. He raised his bow. Nothing happened. He raised it again. Still nothing. The bow no longer possessed its magical powers. It was no more than a giant turtle's toenail. King Andong cried in despair, "It's over." He turned his horse and sped back to the palace. There he found Tan Chao standing in the courtyard, clutching a cloak of white goose feathers. The king hoisted her up behind him on the horse's back and said, "The invaders are closing in. We must flee. Hold on to me tightly." Off they galloped, leaving the palace behind, and soon passing beyond the capital's southern gate. Before long it was nightfall. Swifter than the wind, the horse carried them through dark forests. The road seemed no more than a blur. Tan Chao loosened hair flew wildly in the wind, and she longed for daylight. Throughout the night, however, she pulled feathers from her cloak to strew on the trail behind them. At last the pink glow of dawn began to disperse the darkness, and the stars faded one by one. King Aodong was suddenly startled by the thunderous sound of galloping horses pursuing them. He turned around but saw nothing save for a few white feathers hanging in the wind. He dug his heels into the horses' flanks and raced towards the reddening horizon. Princess Tan Chao was seized with sudden, terrible doubt. Who would be pursuing them? No one but her husband would know to follow the path of white feathers. But if Tan had invaded, Trung Tai would be engaged in battle, certainly not looking for her this soon. Her heart sunk, and she understood that she had been betrayed. Sickened, she remembered how Trung Tai had once said, "If Tan invades our two kingdoms, must defend ourselves. Our cavalry are second to none. But how will our lac defend itself?" The princess had smiled and said, "There is no need to worry about our lac. My father has a magic crossbow from the river god Kim Ki. He needs only to aim it at enemy troops to instantly disperse them." Trung Tai's face had lit up as he said, "Magnificent! But have you ever seen the magic bow yourself? Have you ever held it?" "I have indeed. I know where my father keeps it safely hidden. I will be glad to show it to you." Trung Tai declined. "Of course I would love to see it, but it would not be proper for you to disturb something that belongs to your father." The princess laughed. "What belongs to my father belongs to me. Wait here and I will fetch it." When she returned, she held the magic bow. Trung Tai examined it with great interest, then handed it back, telling her to return it at once. A month later, he asked her if he might see it again. This time the king was gone on business for 3 days, and the princess suggested her husband keep it in his own chambers overnight, if he would like to examine it a bit more carefully. Now the princess understood that her husband had either damaged the magic bow or replaced it with a fake. How could she have been so misled? Her thoughts were interrupted as she realized the king's horse had come to an abrupt halt. They were at the edge of the sea with nowhere else to flee. The rising sun stained the waters blood red. They could hear the horses of their pursuers closing in on them. King Aodong looked up at the sky and over the sea. In anguish he cried, "Mother and father, have you abandoned us? Kim Ki, where are you now?" A golden turtle emerged from the waves and said, "Quick, the enemy is at your back." King Aodong turned around and saw Troy horsemen emerging from the forest, raising a blinding storm of dust and dirt. But the princess, in her sad confusion, believed he was looking at her. Yes, she thought, by replacing her trust in someone who was false, she had caused her country's downfall. She said, "Father, if it was my intention to betray you, let my dead body turn to dust. Otherwise, may drops of blood turn into precious gems to prove my heart was ever faithful to you and our people." She seized her father's sword and stabbed herself. It happened too quickly for King Aodong to prevent it. Her lifeless body fell from the horse. Kim Ki shouted again, "Hurry, the enemy is upon you." King Aodong jumped from his horse and embraced his daughter. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Kim Ki pulled him away and parted the waters to reveal an escape path for the king, a path which led to the sea palace below. The waters closed back over them. The pursuers reached the shore. Trongtai, dressed in black armour, jumped from his horse. King Andong had disappeared. Only his horse stood by the lapping waves. Suddenly, the prince saw his wife's body. Her blood flowed over the sand into the sea. He cried a name and gathered her in his arms. Her body was already cold, but her face was serene. Trongtai could not hold back his tears. He carried her body back to Phong Ki on his horse and buried her in the courtyard of the spiral palace. King Troida conquered Aulak. He joined the two kingdoms and gave them the name Namvit. But his son refused to have anything more to do with him. All day Trongtai sat alone in the places he had once sat with his beloved wife. He remembered how she enjoyed looking at the moon, how she washed her face and changed her clothes. He recalled all their happy times together. Unable to bear his grief any longer, he jumped into the palace well and drowned himself. King Troy moved capital to Fen Nuang and took a new name for himself, Troy Vu. Not long after that, fishermen in Chaldean district discovered pearls tucked in the heart of oysters, which had tasted drops of Princess Tanchal's blood. It was said that if you and penetrating light. People still tell the story of the young couple, expressing regret that the prince betrayed his love's trust. And that is the end of Sangha Storytime. But before we close, we would just like to offer some thanks. We, of course, would like to thank our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, for his teachings, his practice, and this wonderful book. We would like to thank the Plum Village UK communication team, in particular David Jamieson, who has been an ever-present in recording these readings and has led this project. We'd like to thank the readers from our Sangha, particularly Terry West, who came up with the idea to read this book for Sangha Storytime, Murray Cork, who read for us, and Phuong, who also read a few of the chapters to us. And of course, we would like to thank you for listening and for your deep practice.